Welcome to the Roundtable on the Conference on the Future of Europe in this room and online. The CoFoE, as it is called, was an exciting experiment of deliberative citizen participation on a transnational scale. The report, which contains 49 proposals, which is given to European Parliament on the 9th of May in a symbolic ceremony. We are going to ask today whether this process could give a dynamic, induce a dynamic of change, give a push to European democracy. And I'm very happy that we have distinguished participants here tonight who have been involved directly in the conference. I will introduce the panel, and then we will jump right into the discussion. So on my right, Daniel Freund, I'm very happy that you could make it to come here. Daniel Freund is member of the European Parliament for the European 2019. He has been an observer in the executive board and a member of the plenary of the CoFoE. Then Daniela Vancic is working for Democracy International. She is managing campaigns for direct democracy and strengthening citizen participation and leading advocacy work for citizens to take over Europe. Then Hartung. She has been a co-founder of the House of Europe and nominated as national citizen representative for Germany at the conference for the future of Europe. And Constantin Schäfer worked as a project manager responsible for organizing the European citizen panels at the CoFoE. And he is also a postdoc researcher at the Center for Global Government Studies at Catholic University, Leiden. So, how will we proceed? There will be a first round of statements here on the panel and a second round of discussion. And then we will open up to questions from the audience here in the room, but also from the audience online. You can write your questions in the chat, and we will then forward them to the panel. There is one organizational request, because this is recorded and because we have this online format. Please keep chats in the audience to a minimum so that the people who are following us via Zoom can understand us in an optimal way. So let's start. Daniel, this was an experiment, as I said, of directly engaging citizens in the deliberation about the future of Europe. They were chosen by lot, and they came up with important proposals. What was your motivation as a member of the European Parliament to engage in this process?
Well, thanks first of all for having me, and it's great to continue the discussion now that we have those proposals. For me, I mean, I'm a very convinced European. I have been thinking about basically how can we improve the Union, including through treaty change, pretty much since the moment that the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, right? Because it wasn't the Constitution, it wasn't what we had set out a bit over 20 years ago to do, and the question was, how can we do it? And when in the European Parliament we started thinking about this 2.5 years ago, well, we looked at what went wrong, why did the referenda in France and in the Netherlands and later in Ireland, why was there so much trouble with the ratification? And the conclusion that we draw was, well, we need to bring citizens into the core of the process. We cannot have another exercise where some constitutional experts and politicians sit down in a closed door setting and then come with a surprise that we then put to the vote in some other states to ratify all this. And I personally found the examples that we had seen of the citizens' assemblies in Ireland very inspiring. Even, I think, the climate convention that took place in France, the process itself was quite inspiring. Different question how much of that in the end got implemented, but you know, the idea then was that I proposed to the others in the parliament from the other political groups working on this was, let's try to do something along the lines of the Irish Citizens' Assemblies for this. And I have to say now, looking back at the last year, lots of, I mean, you know, I see quite a lot of experts of deliberative democracies and citizens' assemblies here in the room as well. Lots of tiny things that could have been done better, but I think overall what we see now, the outcomes are good. The process worked, and particularly, I mean, for someone that is, you know, a representative that has been elected to a parliament, almost frustrating to see how in the actual negotiations, when it came down to it, in the working groups, particularly in the even smaller formats, when we, you know, before we finalized the papers in the working groups, and since they haven't really been changed, that's where it happened, right? And we were sitting there with one representative from the council, from the parliament, from the citizens, the commissioner Ursula was in those negotiations. And it felt like whenever we had a point as parliament delegation, you know, I mean, we coordinated everything among the political groups. So I wasn't just representing myself or not even just the Greens, but, you know, a large majority in the European Parliament. Yet the council repeatedly was like, you know, whatever the parliament brings, we don't care, put that away. Whereas if it came from the citizens, or if you could argue, look, this was something that came up in that citizen panel and was approved with that majority, the council representatives dared much less to put it aside. So I have to say, you know, from that point of view, it did help us to make something. I think, I mean, if you look at the 326 measures that are on the table now, I don't think anyone, I mean, even me, I wouldn't have imagined it to be so good, so complete. You know, we had hoped, of course, for, you know, lots of points on getting rid of unanimity, to strengthening representative, but also direct democracy, that we have now a recommendation for European referenda in this. And for someone like me that went into the process, look, I want to change the treaties, but even I didn't dare to say, look, we're going to start with a blank sheet of paper, and the citizens came with a recommendation. They want a new constitutional convention. After the whole experience of Lisbon, I found that quite motivating, I have to say.
Thanks. Yes, we'll come back to the question how this will continue. Daniela, you can be described as a sympathetic critic of the whole process. You were always formulating, constantly reminding how important it is that the conference is inclusive, that it really is up to critical public, and you also promoted it by posting open letters and these things, and warning that this could end up in partisan payment. So did the CoFoE reach out and succeed in reaching out to this people?
Yeah, I mean, let me just first say that we're very, very welcoming of the conference. So the critique comes from, I think, a place of love, because we're so welcoming of the process. And the first announcement, when von der Leyen said we will have this conference on the future of Europe, it will bring citizens together as equal partners at equal eye level. I mean, for us, it was also very, okay, this is a chance, this is where maybe something historic can happen. And I think we have that. I mean, we really have that. The critique comes from these points that we can improve the process. And it's, I think Carsten has said these words, it's an experiment, but an experiment is not an excuse, right? And so this is why we have been critical, if there's a nicer word maybe to say critical, of some points, especially when it comes to the European citizens panels, the points about the experts. I would just go into lots of detail about that. How experts were chosen is very, very questionable as well. I think this could have been done a lot better. Typically the case for citizens assemblies, mini publics, there would be an independent advisory board that would choose experts, or maybe even why not the citizens choose experts themselves too, that there would be a panel put in front of them and they would also be able to choose what kind of input that they would like to get in. So this was one critique we had, is how experts were chosen. Also the composition of the European citizens panels. Yeah, were they really that inclusive? I don't think so. I think there was a lot of marginalized groups that were really pushed out of the process, where the future of Europe also affects them greatly. For example, non-EU citizens, non-EU passport holders who are residents in Europe, or stateless people. I'm also a non-EU citizen, a resident of over 5 years now in Europe, and I have many visions and dreams for Europe, and I would, for example, not be invited to a process like this just because I would be automatically excluded. And I think these are really important points to think about going forward if and we hope there is a convention process, how to make it more inclusive. Because we have a really good example now and really great lessons learned this time around, but also 20 years ago from the last convention, and we do need to bring citizens closer. And what does that look like? Maybe it's expanding how we view citizenship also more just the peoples of Europe. So there are some points that we're critical about, but I think that's justified. But overall, it has been, I think, a really great process. We can be very proud of the proposals we have on the table, and they're not perfect. Not every single one I think is perfect, but that's also perfectly okay. This was an experiment, and I think it gives us good ground and a really good mandate to go forward. So the conference is not the end. I mean, it really is just sets the perfect groundwork for the next stage.
Okay, thanks. Stephanie, as another civil society representative, you were involved as, or invited as a representative from parts of Europe, but also as a representative for Germany, so for a national public. And so 2 questions. What do you think that was somehow a tension or a conflict? And being a civil society and a national representative, and how did the national and European levels were connected? Were you satisfied how this was connected?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was very happy to be allowed to be part of this experiment, because as Daniela just said, I mean, being founder of a pro-European movement, you can just only be happy if Brussels opened its doors like this and invites citizens to its heart in the European Parliament. I mean, technically speaking, and we talked a lot about the forms already, technically speaking, my role as a national citizens representative was a bit unclear from the very beginning. It is mentioned in the rules of procedure, but from the beginning, nobody really knew what it was about. But then eventually, when these national panels were organized in at least 7 EU member states, as far as I recall, 6 or 7, not that much, unfortunately, but still also in Germany. Then, I mean, eventually I had also a technical function, which was representing those national recommendations and bringing them into the CoFoE process, which I think was best made in the working groups, where we actually, I mean, that was at least the saying which we heard of, where we enriched the proposals, the 178 proposals that came from the 178 recommendations that came from the 4 European panels, where they were enriched by debates with the politicians and the working groups, plus that we as national citizens representatives then had a chance to really bring in these national perspectives. I didn't see a conflict much because, and that was something that was very, very interesting to me. I mean, there was a lot of, let's say, I mean, a lot of the same approaches coming from the national German panel and from the European panel. So I wouldn't call it unanimous, but I would call it very, very much matching. And so that was my final impression, that the citizens, they were really willing to debate, but also to make compromises, and then to finally agree, on a common line. And what we have in here really makes me proud. And just to make this last point, I totally agree that there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of what was not that brilliant, what we should not see a second time. But I think now, as we are running out of time in relation to many topics that are in here, climate change and others, we really should get this now into reality. And in parallel, let's talk about, how to make it better a second time. But this is really now the point to get into making this come true.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So, Constantin, you were involved in the CoFoE as a person who was responsible in a way for the design. So, when you hear all this, it was supposed to be inclusive, participatory, transnational. How did you feel you could realize these demands, and how would you say, were you satisfied with the process? How was it set up, and how did it develop? Maybe you can just give us some information on that.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it was very interesting to talk about inclusion. Also, what Daniela said already, I think one big issue for us was the issue of multilingualism. Not only because it's the first time that on this level so many people came together with so many different languages that we basically all had to include in deliberations. 23, I think, or 24 languages for 200 people in each of these panels. So whenever we would not take multilingualism into account well enough, it would mean we exclude people, because the capability to speak English, of course, also correlated with other socio-demographic variables. So I think that was something we really put key focus on. For example, through simultaneous interpretation, basically all formal meetings, we tried to have simultaneous interpretation, which of course also made up a huge part of the budget. But on the other hand, there is formal meetings and there's also informal meetings. And informal meetings, of course, it's very hard for people who don't speak English and don't speak a common language to really take part in these informal meetings. That relates to the citizen panels, also to the conference plenary, where at the conference plenary we had people who spoke English well most of the time, but even there, a significant number of citizens, for example, did not. And so this was always something we had to be aware of. We always had to remind also the common secretariat, for example, like our people who were responsible for it, that we shouldn't do too many things that where only people who speak English can participate. And but also it relates in the panels. For example, when there's deliberation going on, there's people work on text, that in more text tools need to be inclusive and made for multilingual deliberation. So we work with automatic translation, for example, a lot with basically spreadsheets where we build in functions where there was not perfect. And people who have observed it have seen many flaws and sometimes being irritated about the automatic translations. But that basically there's a lack of tools here that actually still need to be developed. Also to visualize, text to visualize and cluster, let's say, ideas in different languages for that purpose. So the inclusion part is big, and I think it also relates to one other key challenge in the process, which is the multimodality. So we try to combine online and offline deliberations with different sessions. Of course, that was interestingly not designed from the beginning on. Kind of COVID forced us a bit into it. So the first session, for example, was completely on-site session. The second session was completely online, also because it took part in winter, where it was not possible to meet anymore. The third session was a hybrid session, where we had online and offline participants. So what we observed there was also, I think, inclusion also means that we offer people the chance to participate from home. Because some people were not able to attend all sessions, to leave their familiar environments and stuff. So I think that was really important, and I think we didn't experience so much screen fatigue and so much problems that also come with offline participation. I think many facilitators make a big effort to include also people who were participating online, although that also then these people are often excluded from the informal discussions. So that was quite interesting. Many learnings that we have, I think, from both the multilingual aspect and also the multimodal aspect, where we can build up on the future, developing, for example, better tools, multilingual tools, and combining the different online and offline methods to be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting aspect, this multilingual platform and the technical innovations that make it possible to deal with this area that is often brought up when it comes to the European democracy. Well, we don't only have one language to discuss. I would like to focus again on the from the inclusion to the legitimacy of the process. What seems important is embedding this whole discussion in a process of public deliberation, which really puts these issues that we want the EU to address on the table. And one thing we already touched upon this afternoon, one problem was that we, as observers of this experiment, were very thrilled about it, but that was, well, not so much attention in the general public. So the problem was that this process could be a kickoff for a process that is now going to start and maybe catch up on this lack of attention. But I mean, it's a crucial observation that the CoFoE made its way into the coalition treaty, for example, for the traffic light coalition, but played no role in the election campaign whatsoever. So there wasn't much debate about this. And so the role of the media is certainly something that, what's your opinion on that? And how does it affect the legitimacy of the process? Maybe Daniela.
I think, I mean, the main reason for why the public attention to this process has been somewhat limited was that from the outset it was unclear if anything happens with this. We did not manage in the beginning to get a firm commitment from the participating institutions to say what comes out of this process we're going to do. And even, I would go even further. I mean, on the day that the online platform was launched, 12 countries came out and said, you know, none of this has any sort of legal value and we don't want it. And basically asking that, you know, in a dialogue with citizens, you ask them, how do you imagine the future of the EU? Please check with your favorite EU lawyer first whether this can be done in the current treaty framework or not. This is a very strange way of starting a dialogue with citizens that are not EU lawyers. But that's apparently how 12 countries saw it. And now we're at 13 that say, you know, I mean, I would say varying degrees of, you know, wanting to take this, the outcome seriously or not. But that's basically the question. I still think that, you know, if we now actually trigger a convention, if people realize, oh, this is not just some, you know, discussion workshop where a bunch of NGO people and some politicians and citizens sit down and hold a broad debate. Now, this is actually a reform process like we've never seen it before, that then they will look at it in more detail and hopefully also look back at what has already happened and recognize, you know, that this has quite a solid, you know, with lots of little flaws. And I agree, there are certain people that we come up, and obviously there is to a certain degree as well. If you call people up and ask them if they want to participate, well, some people say no, we cannot force them, send the police and make them participate or anything. So yes, there's flaws, but there is also a participation to a degree that hasn't been there, and that I think gives this a legitimacy like no previous reform process had before the actual ratification started.
Mm-hmm. Daniela, would you agree? Or?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Of course, I think the question on the media is, a big question about the European public sphere that is missing, not so existing European public sphere. And I think it was because the fact that the conference, there was not this binding feature, there was not any promises, nothing, no kick for the media to take, perhaps we may have from. It was just another nice democratic experiment that was taking place, and maybe the lives of 800 were changed, but what does it really mean beyond that? And I think that's something we need to think about also going forward, is how to work closer with media, national media, and not just have Euractiv and the other European media that was covering the conference very well. We need to also think about how to bring then national, local, regional media into this. But that's a little bit the chicken egg situation again, because you need this binding, like this kick that media can take up that will be interesting for them. I think though, if there is a convention, this will change things a bit. This will, I think, be a lot more interest for media, because then it has the potential to change the rules of the game of the EU. And that's still a conversation that's very up here level for most people, of course. But that's also the media's job a little bit to kind of dissect that, make it into words that's easier for the average person to understand.
Okay, so I mean, it's obviously coming down to a question of power. That will be interesting how this plays out, and how you need this experiment public, and how this all can be carried out. What do you see as the problem? Why isn't this, as a national representative, I'm sure you realize that this wasn't taken up in the national public as we desired it to be taken up. And the National Forum was only in January after the Auswärtige Amt, then was speeding up to organize something. When I was sitting there and saw that in France everything had already happened, so we don't contribute anything. So this was something.
Well, I mean, no doubt the conference had a huge marketing problem, and to put it very frank, I mean, European politics is not very sexy, full stop. And I mean, we are always, engaged in getting people interested in these subjects and making them aware that, I mean, even voting in your home country has always a European influence. But still, I mean, as Daniela said, I mean, the outcome was unclear from the very beginning, and it still is. And that is maybe why media said, look, I mean, this is just not interesting enough to really address it, even though whenever I had been in contact with media representatives, I was a bit shocked on how little they knew about the whole process. And again, I mean, the whole process as such also was complicated. Though I must say, I mean, the idea was big, and an idea that is big is always, including that there are going to be, obstacles to overcome, problems that nobody had foreseen. So I wouldn't really want to blame the conference for having been maybe a bit too big. Yeah, and again, it was an experiment, and things were allowed that were never been allowed before like this. So I'm willing to accept that if there's a second conference of that kind, I'm sure that many things will be different. But still, for this first one, I'm happy with it. And if we can now really start working on the proposals, I hope that we will get the traction that those proposals deserve. So, I mean, for me, the conference has definitely not yet stopped. my regularly travels to Strasbourg have now stopped for a while, which is okay because we all have a separate life apart from being members of the plenary. But I'm really focusing with other activists on the follow-up process, which is not yet really clear. We have been promised many things, like we will see each other again in September, October, like we will have another reunion in a year from now. And once we really start talking on substance, and if we might see that Article 48 works, then we will get media attraction. So I haven't yet given up.
Okay, but that's still a very procedural perspective. So the question, I totally agree that this would be maybe something to change the game, but substantially from the proposals that the citizens made, it seems so spooky to me that we have these national debates which do not put the flashlight in the corners where the music plays, because Europe is so important and all these issues that the report brings up, or there are many issues that ought to be addressed on a European level. And the deeper you get into it, the more you get frustrated how little knowledge there is, how little motivation there is to take up these issues and to discuss them on the national level, and then but also in a transnational perspective. So, and then you get all these repetitions of prejudices all the time. So somehow we're allocating our attention, for example, the national election campaigns on the wrong corners. We do not put the flashlight where the music plays. So in Europe, it's really, and that's maybe something you would, of course, agree to. But how do we get this into the flashlight of national discussions, which are about sovereignty and all this discourse that is a kind of chimera, because we are not discussing the real things, and nobody dares to campaign on that. So that's a statement of frustration more than a question, but maybe you can take this up. Your turn.
So what I got from when it comes to media also was that many regional media, as I said before, were taking up personal stories of people who were actually of their personal journeys from their little hometowns, little villages, into the citizen panels, maybe, and also into the plenary meeting politicians. And I found that quite interesting. And I think maybe also what national media also didn't understand all the time was how innovative this whole process was in terms of bringing these random citizens together with these professional politicians or say representatives, and what kind of magic or also conflict and clash of cultures also can be interesting to observe also from a media perspective. I remember from the first or second plenary sessions when citizens came to the hemicycle, they were constantly wondering why, for example, the hemicycle is half empty, not knowing that maybe this is a normal parliamentary feature, actually, that the debates in the hemicycle are not very well attended. Then complaining that people actually having a series of monologues in the plenary, not really deliberating, because they were just coming from citizen deliberations. They were wondering, why are people not responding to each other? And this is so awkward. Why doing 5 minute speeches without actually interacting with each other? But it was just a clash of cultures, and I think what we did also together with the Common Secretariat was to increase in the next plenaries the chance to react on each other with blue cards, where actually directly react to the speaker. And that was also a learning process from both sides here, from the politics, parliamentarians, but also citizens, how actually the other side thinks and works. And I think this is something, if we talk about media attention, that could have been covered much more. This clash of culture and also this clash of legitimacy logics, because some of these then like arguments at the very end also of the process between citizens who say, I'm here representing the 800 randomly selected citizens, and then politicians say, yeah, but I'm here elected by 6 million Polish people in my constituency. I think this is also very, very interesting clash that we've observed and that could have been exploited, let's say, in a public debate more.
So there was definitely a learning process from within those who were included. but the spillover to the general public is difficult to arrange. So, any ideas how this could be improved? Of course, it's unfair to give the burden those who are involved in the process, but maybe any reasons for why this is the case.
Yeah, maybe I would just add something. I think we also can't expect that just from one time, this session of European citizens panels, that it will have this kind of huge multiplying ripple effect in Europe. That's not going to happen. But I mean, if we institutionalize European citizens panels and they're really anchored into law, and you do this regularly, then I mean, the dream is maybe in 20, 30 years time, everybody will have been either randomly selected or know somebody close to them that has been randomly selected that has then been part of this process. And then you have really this multiplying effect, because it's not just these 800 that were randomly selected, but they went home to their families and their friends and they told their people in their close surroundings about what they experienced there, right? So it had already in their intimate setting some kind of effect. But the idea is, I think you can't just do this and have it one and done and expect it's going to solve all the problems. And I think if you do this regularly and you anchor it into law, then you can see only after maybe some years it's really going to have that multiple.
I think at the end, if we look at those settings at the national level that worked, take the Irish example, take the French example, I think two different factors that made those very visible in their respective national context. The Irish knew that there was going to be a referendum, so from the outset, everyone looked at it because, well, they will have to vote at the end of the procedure, and so the debate and, in a way, the deliberative process that happened among the 150 citizens in the assembly didn't only happen there, but it happened in a large share of the Irish electorate that then supported the recommendations with a huge majority. The French Climate Convention, well, it had more solid buy-in, at least for the process, from the highest political level, right? And Macron went and stood there, and citizens told him their recommendations, and he reacted. And I think that contributed to a much larger visibility. I wouldn't be so skeptical, though. I mean, yes, there's always more potential for this, but I think the conference has reached sort of an interested audience, I would say, across the EU. I mean, anyone that works on EU issues, anyone that works on democracy issues, I think has heard about this in Europe, and already that's something. I mean, if you compare with the National Citizens Assembly that we had in Germany on Germany's role in the world, at least we didn't do worse than that. That is also not a process that every German knows about and about that place. Yeah, it's not, it's not the easiest, and obviously a full buy-in by the governments would have helped. But I think we already got reasonably far given the circumstances.
Okay, before we open for the questions you might be able to ask, we could put a flashlight perhaps on the 49 proposals and where are the issues that where citizens articulate the wish to have more Europe, if you want, and how would you, because you were so enthusiastic about the great proposals in this report, maybe you could just talk about this for a while. What is in there? What are the issues that citizens want to be taken up? And again, why are the crucial structural issues hidden as proposals 38, 39 that are about democracy in Europe? And these crucial issues are somehow hidden in between, but that's perhaps to academic questions. So first, maybe, the substance of those proposals.
Well, I mean, if you ask in which areas do people want more Europe, I think what most citizens addressed was not the technical Europe. but it was feeling European, moving closer to each other, get to know more about each other, like, having more exchange programs, but also getting, independent, more independent from the world. And these were recommendations that were worked on before we had the war in Ukraine. So I think many recommendations came from the heart and from the belly, and not so much from, technical aspects, which I think also makes it now, in fact, and we addressed this earlier, that many of these proposals have now need to become, something that is being translated into EU law. But the citizens, in fact, I think they saw themselves as being experts of life, and they wanted to bring in this very, very practical perspective, which I think makes these proposals in parts so valuable. I wouldn't really subscribe to your excuse me, to your notion that many let's say hot topics, institutional topics are hidden. I think this is rather a technical issue. We have these 178 citizens' recommendations, which then were worked on in the working groups, and they were, kind of transformed into these 49 proposals with 326 measures to fill them up. And then, in fact, we have like a proposal 39 from the working group on European democracy, where we have the call for setting the veto aside. But this is not hidden. This is normal. I wouldn't call it hidden, Daniel. I know that that some would have maybe wanted it to be more prominent even, but if you read it carefully, you will actually find it twice, also in the working group on EU and the world, where I have been participating. And I think we have to read all proposals, and it's not only about institutional proposals. Maybe they are the most critical now because they attract the most attention, but there's a lot in here. And
do you have a favorite one?
no, please don't ask me for a favorite one, because that makes it so so difficult, as if they would be kind of top 10. There's so much need for so much in here that I really cannot say this is the one. I'm always coming through this idea of strengthening European identity. That is what I'm very, very keen about, because I think that is what is kind of an underlying prerequisite for a stable European Union, trust in each other, and really standing next to each other. And if you feel not only national but also European, this makes a lot much easier, and would maybe also help the Council to get things forward.
I still have the impression that some proposals are a bomb and some proposals are like, increase student exchange. So, and that's just mentioned next to each other. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of should think about kind of recommendations, right? And then there are some that are really very precise, and if you actually implement it, it will change a huge deal. If you look at the proposals on the online platform that got most support, out of the top 10, 6 are on the question of unanimity. And I think the question of unanimity, like no other proposal, has not only come up in the democracy working group, but I think pretty much in all of them, right? So I think this is one of the core proposals. And it's sort of, if you go out to the street and ask anyone sort of what's the biggest issue about Europe, I don't think that normal citizens will necessarily come with that answer. And this has sort of led many in Brussels before, and still lots of governments are now saying, look, this is not what the citizens really want. They now care about inflation or, things of daily life. But the interesting thing about this conference is that if you actually sit down with citizens and discuss how do you want to change Europe, they come with lots of concrete issues first. And then as soon as you discuss for 2 minutes, why hasn't Europe solved that issue? Why hasn't Europe fixed that large companies don't pay taxes? Why has Europe not fixed that our fundamental rights and the rule of law isn't better protected? Well, immediately, second step is, well, unity, because one country is blocking that happens. And I think that's, for me, what has come out of this process, that this idea that citizens don't want to change any of the fundamentals or the institutional issues of the union is just bonus. They have, very normal people that have never in their life spent much time thinking about Europe, have within a couple of hours of looking at this, identified the key issues that someone like me sitting in the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Parliament have been looking at for years. So I think that's that's good to see, at least, that this is not just something for constitutional lawyers, but that ordinary citizens identify these things very early.
I'd just like to add one thing here. I think it's true for specific policy areas, specific political problems, that if you confront them, citizens, with that, they quickly say, okay, if the problem is unity, then we need to get rid of this. On the other hand, I was lucky enough to facilitate the citizen group, the Citizens Panel on Democracy, where the discussion around unanimity and majority voting was discussed in very abstract terms, without policy area connected to it. And I found it very interesting that many citizens are also very concerned that their own country also gets outvoted by others. And that basically their own country also loses the chance of influence and veto power, especially the ones who came from smaller countries. So I think citizens, the question of more versus less Europe, which I also posed before, is very abstract for citizens, but at some, if you tackle or if you propose specific solutions to problems with more Europe, I think they're very much in favor. But they also, if you tell to them, do you want more Europe in abstract terms, they also have they're also concerned and a bit afraid about more Europe. I don't know what that is, especially also in Eastern Europe. So I think if you find specific solutions to problems with more Europe, then I think they're in. But again, let's say absolute majority voting is also something that would frighten them a bit.
But just one point on this is, there is a number of governments that have done that exercise as well, right? The Brits were always saying, no, we want to take some powers back. And then they went through all the ministries and asked, what is it actually? And they couldn't come up with anything. The Dutch have done this as well. If you read the 326 measures in the report, there isn't a single one that says less Europe on anything, right? There isn't one proposal where citizens said, no, Europe should really get out of this. And I think that in a way is telling, no? That at the end of the day, yeah, well, big surprise, it makes sense to work together, and we're better if we work together among 27 rather than everyone for themselves.
I would add one thing, without repeating everything that's been said, I just wanted to bring the attention a little bit to one proposal, also one on direct democracy. So I think this, there's an interesting parallel with the presentation by Andrea earlier. So there's the call for introducing direct democracy, the one on that there should be EU-wide referendums, but triggered only by the European Parliament. And I mean, as Democracy International, we are a direct democracy organization. We, of course, think this is not ambitious enough. I mean, for us, it should be from the bottom up. And I think it's interesting, the presentation by Andrea said that citizens' assemblies, they will not get to the same ambitious outcomes like social movements, I guess you can say associations, also in this case, because citizens' assemblies have been working on this in just a few weekends to get to this outcome, and social movements or associations have for years, or if not decades, on these kind of issues. So I think it's on this particular point, which is very close to the work of Democracy International, it shows just perfectly just the from this presentation that we had. So I think the proposals themselves are, as I mentioned, I don't think that they're perfect on their own, but it's already setting the ground for more work to be done, and it's at least, if anything, the introduction for maybe these new kind of instruments or new laws and so on. It's a starting point for us.
Okay, so shall we open for the general public and the questions, the general public in this room and online? Anyone here in the room who wants to raise?
Not really a question, but a comment on this media, sort of how to kick off the media. What I realized is because in Bonn, one of the younger students has been randomly selected, and she was very proud of it. And apparently she was very active because you could listen in several, whatever, tiny Bonn journals or radio, sort of local radio stations, which she would talk about the conference. So it was just sort of interesting for me to see that if a young person is really kicked off by this conference and then uses the conference to go back to her constituency, which was the town of Bonn, there was this sort of I represent whole one, you know, sort of thing. And this was amazing. So I was just wondering when I got sort of this, how could this be scaled up? Because if those in the conference could connect to where they come from and do this identity building, I'm here to represent the town of Bonn, then something apparently was happening. Yeah? I do not want to overstate the case. I do not want to say how much sort of in terms of technical clicks we had, or I don't know. But even I realized that somebody of Bonn was in this conference. Yeah, so somehow it worked via this way.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, I was just struck by the fact that in the end we are talking about unanimity and treaty change, but there's so much in the report that's not about unanimity and certainly not about treaty change. And it seems a bit that now the legacy of the conference is being focused on the question: is there going to be a convention, and are we steering towards treaty change? And I suspect that Parliament has a big hand in that. You can be talking about that. But actually, I would say that's a shame. I mean, are we over-focusing on the question of treaty change? While it's about topics from the value, as you were saying, Stephanie. I mean, many of them don't require treaty change. Why aren't we pressing on the action there rather than spending so much for that energy and indeed focusing our assessment of the success of the conference on the question of whether indeed there will be unanimity in any case? I mean, I think that for many of the issues that we're talking about is in the end about both political will and not necessarily about the So I'm a bit afraid about over focusing and making this question of treaty, why there's so much more original stuff that the Parliament has also about before. That's not about treaty change, and that simply requires more imagination and smart policy makers who translate nice ideas into policies that can already be taken under the current treaties.
I would mention two things. For me, this question of treaty change and whether you're willing to implement all the ideas in of the 326, I think treaty change is sort of a good indicator of your willingness to do anything about all the recommendations, because treaty change are the biggest ones and the most difficult to implement. So if you're willing to do that, you're more certain. I mean, I haven't met anyone that says, "Oh, I'm all for the treaty change," but all the stuff that can be done by legislative procedure, that I don't want to touch. So I think it's an indicator. Second element is that on treaty change, Parliament can actually do it. Parliament has the right of initiative for treaty change, where we don't have the right of initiative so far. It's one of the recommendations to initiate legislative procedures, to propose laws, right? I mean, absolutely, there's lots of stuff that we need to do. There's changes to the budget, there's changes to various, I mean, when citizens ask for more transparency in the council, for example, we need to change the rules of procedure in the council. We don't need to change the treaties. The council can just do it if they want to. There's also lots of stuff that would require national law or the practice in member states to change, and some stuff is basically just, I I mean, when citizens want more information about what's going on in Europe, well, I mean, that's for media, I guess, to do something about it. But for me, really, the question of treaty change, you know, if you dismiss those, well, then you're already putting aside, in a way, some of the most ambitious proposals, and then probably you're also against all the rest. And the Commission says that they're gonna, you know, address this. If you look at some of the recommendations, you can also argue that many of them are on their way, right? That there should be more climate protection. Yeah, I mean, we're discussing the Green Deal and Fit for 55 and now Repower EU. I mean, there are things happening, and many of the recommendations are worded in a way, you know, if they ask for more investment in renewable energy, yeah, that's happening. Is that enough now? Well, that you know, depending on which political party you ask, you're going to hear no, not enough. Some are going to say, well, already too much. But we can probably, if you want to go through a box ticking exercise and sit and say, have we done anything about this recommendation or not? I mean, on something like investment in renewable energy, it would be fairly easy to tick that box, you know, because we're legislating and deciding on that on a pretty regular basis.
Would you like to add something, or any one of you?
Yeah, maybe. I totally agree. We have to do both. Yeah, we have to make sure that, in principle, all 49 proposals have a chance to get reality. So we need also to touch upon treaty change, but by the same time, we shouldn't forget what is all in here. And what I think should not be underestimated, we just talked about the marketing problem of the conference. It's all about communication. So we should quickly communicate what is already on the way, because this is also a kind of a citizen's demand. They have put so much effort in it, and it's a valuable information to know that many of the proposals are already, either existing or on the way, or they could improve or whatever. So it's, again, communicate, and that's so difficult. I mean, you cannot communicate from Brussels to the whole EU. You really have to understand every local politician that what he or she does in her policies is, always kind of connected to European politics. And I cannot really stop emphasizing how important that is to really include citizens on a regular basis also in these kind of, processes. Yeah. I think for many of us who participated in this conference, it was not about telling politicians how to do their job, but it's about being heard and, being treated with respect and take it serious what we have done here. So, I totally agree. All the 49 are important, but of course, some require a little bit of pre-work.
But one thing you just said, Europe cannot contact the 450 million Europeans, but we have a bit over 10,000 now that have submitted a proposal on the online platform. Yeah. You submitted some. Why aren't we sending those people an email now? Because there we have email addresses. Why aren't we telling those people, look, your proposal that you made on the online platform, maybe not one-to-one, but look at recommendation 37 sub-item 3. Yeah. Your idea, no, but your idea was actually discussed in the conference. It's there in the conclusions. It didn't just disappear. How are we not getting back to people now saying, well, thanks for your input and we took this on board? Or even if we didn't, well, thanks for your contribution. This was discussed. The conference suggested something else. They felt it's better done with this idea. I think that would, it's not 450 million, but it's at least, those that have made the effort of contributing something, they should at least get a reply, no?
I agree, although of course you can be critical with who participated in the platform and I agree.
But anyone could.
I agree. Yeah, and there will be, for example, for the European citizens panel, these 800, there will be a follow-up event. in autumn, and where actually exactly what you just said will happen, and also the institutions report back on what of their recommendations. These 178 recommendations are not only in the proposals now, but also are worked on, as said already, will be worked on in the future and by the European Commission. So there will be at least a first step for a follow-up in the process from the European Citizen Panel side. And one thing I think I also want to say, because you also said something about let's say how people relate to the citizens who were selected randomly. I think this is also very, very important for the legitimacy of the whole process. Not only in terms of cities where people come from, but also, let's say, different professions. If there's a farmer, for example, from Denmark or wherever, that people actually at home see these stories, see these people and say like, okay, this is someone like me, and I can relate to this person. And this, I think, is the main key for citizen panels, randomly selected, very mini publics, to increase legitimacy to this whole process. That actually these people could be anyone, and that people at home know this.
Can you ask him how is the staff who could do the 10,000 emails? Because is it staff? Because if you want to do this, you would need really people to
become a secretariat.
I don't know actually if the common secretariat
Yeah.
still exists
I think
now,
it
or
will.
is it already been dissolved. I don't know.
Germany.
It could well be that they have been relocated over to the. But yeah, I mean, whatever. I don't know how big exactly the comms unit in the European Parliament and in the Commission, they should be capable of putting, I don't know how many people it needs, 5, 6, that sit on this for a couple of months and answer the proposals.
Yes. So I'd be interested to hear from the panelists what you think, what kind of a democratic process this is, because it remains very vague to me. How would we describe it? Is it consultation? Is it participatory democracy? Is it deliberative democracy? And how does it fit into a larger picture or understanding of EU democracy? We heard from Ulrike Gero that the individual participants understand themselves as representatives of local communities. But I mean, if you look at randomly selected assemblies from a democratic theory perspective, then members are exactly not expected to understand themselves as representatives of local communities. So how does this amount to a systematic picture of the democratic process? How would you describe it?
Well, I would say that just the assembly part, the panel, is a bit like a focus group, right? In comparison to a survey, here they actually discuss, they get some input, and then they come with something. The step where I was when we conceived this, where I was more unsure, was how much sense does it make for them then to also sit in the plenary. And it gets even weirder with Stephanie, that was just one from Germany. And just to tell you, the reason this came about was that we in the parliament argued very early on that there should be 108 members of the European Parliament and 108 members of national parliaments. The reason is that you need 4 per member state so that it starts being somewhat representative of the political composition at the member state level. If you would have just taken 2, there would have basically been a huge overrepresentation of conservatives and social democrats. There wouldn't have been any Greens, there wouldn't have been any left, there wouldn't have, I mean, then you exclude most of the party family. Well, and the French government at the time was like, well, if there's 108 national parliamentarians and European parliamentarians, there need to be 108 citizens. And then it was like, well, the 4 panels, 20 each, so 10% of those, but then you have only 18. So then you need 28 more. So let's take 1 from each member state, and then you're still 1 short. Let's who could be the super citizen? Well, is the president of the youth forum. Let's take 1 young person in there as well. That's how it came about. No kidding. And how is this representative of anything? And does Stephanie also speak on behalf of me and everyone in Germany, or who represents Germany more? I mean, obviously it gets you into weird questions, but in practice, it actually worked quite well as a mix of, random selection, and then you have all kinds of political levels there. There were the mayors, there were the people from the regional parliaments, national parliaments, European parliaments, from the government. It kind of worked as a debate thing. How legitimate is all of that, and how, at the end of the day, who caved in the debate? It was sort of feeling in the room of everyone kind of wanting to come to a conclusion and giving in sometimes, not giving in other times.
But maybe just to add to this, I mean, I think we focus so much on the European citizens panels, but it's really the plenary that's a really interesting mechanism in this, because then you take the citizens who have really developed some kind of ownership of these proposals and you put them in a room with politicians who maybe also come with their own ideas, of course, and then it's really interesting dynamics when you see it play out. So it was really, I mean, experimental, but it's really the plenary mechanism that I think we can look at and dissect and analyze until tomorrow, I'm sure.
There are two other questions from you.
University of London. So I actually have a follow-up question, not so much broad theoretical, but more down to earth, which is I think also a follow-up question to the previous session. What was the task of the citizens panel? Is it drafting concrete reform proposals which are then implemented, or is it just giving a general impulse which is then considered by decision makers of representative democracy to turn them into reforms? So my question is, if in the future there will be more deliberate panels in EU decision making, what are your proposals for the institutional design? If you look at Article 48, I can still imagine that's a long process, that we can design something which fits into treaty reform. However, with regard to ordinary legislative procedures, which are already about 3 years long with a consultative phase before, how do we do that? Can we really have such deliberate panels for secondary legislation on the EU level? And if I may, a second question, Daniela just described that he felt a little bit put aside with his proposals in the plenary from the council representatives. That's something which I also heard from representatives of civil society in the plenary. So my question is, we now talk about deliberative democracy and mini publics. What about these 20 years since the White Book on European Governance about participative democracy, bringing in interest groups and organized civil society? Is there still a future for organized civil society in European democracy, and how do we relate the representation of organized civil society with this kind of new publics?
Can we also take another question, Eva, and then you can choose.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, yes, my question goes into the direction of my structures. One, when we talked about the media coverage, you were quite clear that the main problem was the bindingness of the whole conference. So you somehow drew the story that as always the EP and citizens are very close. They want it to be binding, and member states block. But isn't that too easy? I mean, bindingness is a very, very critical aspect of this whole experiment. And as a EU citizen, I would say, well, I'm not so sure I wasn't represented in this body, and why should these 800 people decide bindingly on any issues, whereas I, as an EU citizen, have not so much to say? So isn't the binding a very, very critical thing, and we can't say, well, it wasn't binding and this was its main proof. Shouldn't the bindingness be a very, very huge discussion that citizens have to debate on?
Okay, so go in different directions. Take up what you would like to address first.
I mean, on the question of bindingness, I mean, I don't think anyone ever said or thought that, the citizens panels write a new treaty and that's it. They make recommendations and they should be taken seriously. Doesn't mean that every one of them gets implemented. Doesn't mean that they get implemented as such, because the actual, laws are made by the European Parliament and the Council. Treaties are changed by the Convention as listed in Article 48. So I'm not saying that we're replacing any of that with citizens panels. I'm saying, there needs to be a certain seriousness about taking what comes out of the citizens panels and doing something with it, or at least to explain why not. That's what I mean with, saying not that it's binding, but that you're going to do something with it at the end. The question of how much are we going to do this type of, citizens panels now as ordinary legislation. The Commission is working. I have been given a paper that they have written. They want to, in the future, do this on certain pieces of legislation, particularly big ones. I think the ambition that they currently have is still way too small. I think you can actually do this for probably a couple of pieces of legislation a year. I wouldn't say, that you do it on every single act, but when you suggest something big, just from the last few years on things like the Green Deal, on things like the kind of digital regulation we do now with the Digital Services Act and the Market Act, this is something that you could have included such a panel on and ask citizens. And it's a good, if you do it well, if you have a proper methodology, if the selection process works somewhat okay, well then this gives you a good idea of if you take any other group of EU citizens with the same methodology, you would get a similar result, right? So hopefully, if the process works well, it will tell you that if my citizens panel gives me a large approval or comes up with a proposal and they vote with a huge majority, 70, 80, 90%, whatever it is, well then, if you then put it to all EU citizens as a law, that you have, with a certain statistical probability, a fair support in the general overall population as well. So I think that makes eminent sense to use this tool, not for everything, but for big decisions.
Maybe to combine a little bit these two questions. I mean, as much as I'm a fan of European citizens panels and citizens assemblies in general, I don't think it should be binding. I don't think that's exactly their role. I think that the focus group is a perfect way to describe the kind of role and mandate that they should have. And if we're thinking about this kind of process or setting in a convention, in an Article 48 convention setting, it would also be unfair, of course, if the European Citizens Panel had the binding mandates that they would have, and then you are not randomly selected. What does that mean for the rest of us? I think that's where we can think about then how to make it more legitimate, how to bring this kind of process all together that all citizens would have a voice. That's why I would call for I would call for an idea of a convention process that there would be an EU-wide vote, that citizens would have at least the chance that they're not randomly selected, which is a very small chance you would be. This would be like the focus group to set recommendations, kind of put together a report and set the ground for what would be happening in a convention. And then at the end, all European citizens, that means really everyone, one person would vote, would have the opportunity to vote on it and either approve it or reject it. But of course, just to avoid all the trauma that we had from 20 years ago, I think the key of involving citizens from the very beginning is the most important thing to make sure that that process is successful and it's not going to lead to a huge rejection. Because I think you might be able to argue that what the French citizens and Dutch citizens 20 years ago, what they rejected was maybe also the process, that a referendum just fell from the sky and they were asked to approve or not approve the text in front of them, and nobody was invited ahead of time to be involved in that. But if we do this right now, we involve citizens, we have European citizens panels, which don't need to have a binding role, but at the end then have an EU-wide vote, which also doesn't need to be binding, but it could be at least the invitation to temperature check how citizens feel about the draft outcome. I think this is where you then close this kind of deficit where what about those who are not the lucky ones to be selected?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Carsten from EU and also active in many NGOs working on this subject. Thanks so much for your work. One question to you, Stefanie, regarding the communication problem and the PR problem, which goes actually in the way Daniela has mentioned. How do you want to really solve this? I have not seen your solution yet, in my view, because if you just invest in a PR company, I think that's not what we want. Right? We will not resolve problems because we have
thousands of public relations companies in Brussels thinking how to overcome the disconnect between citizens for 20, 30 years now. And the idea here was now to have another approach with random citizen assemblies, but by definition they are always silent. This is the silent movement, so to say. And mostly they're also top-down initiated, as is the case with CoFoE. So I would love to hear from you, maybe not right now, but in medium-term discussions, and perhaps already a little bit here, how you would like to resolve this problem by embedding citizen assemblies in the overall institution structure and to connect it with other forms of democratic participation. On the one hand, we have heard from Daniel that in Ireland, which is supposed to be the guiding model, according to Roberta, the Commission Vice President, who was steering the conference. But we heard from Daniel there, the point is that many know that in the end they could actually vote on it. Is this something you would be considering? I have never seen parts of Europe, which I really support a lot, but I've never seen a courageous speech in this direction. The other question, for example, could also be how to, given that it's top-down initiative, why not connecting it with a bottom-up instrument like the European Citizens Initiative, for example? This requires 1 million citizens to ask the EU Commission to legislate on a concrete topic, and then you would have at least 1 million citizens. And if you have a good digital platform, which Daniel just mentioned, sometimes like the first, the ECI banned Live collect 200,000 email addresses, right? You could develop a dynamic with interaction and sort of develop a spiral where you could possibly create a more truly European public space. So these are some ideas why I was wondering, this cannot be done by public relations, right? Sorry to be a bit bold.
Yeah, but this was really big now. So I mean, you started off with communication and how to improve that one. I mean, of course, I'm not APR manager. I just know that that it's important to go where the people are, and you have to do this not on a European level. You have to do this on the local level, on the smallest community level that you can possibly think of. And so, well, yes, indeed, we haven't stood up now as Pulse of Europe for any specific kind of model, but I think whatever you have, it must be low threshold. You have to find something where the European dimension of what you talk about, of what you discuss, is really personally felt. You have to, and that is why I think the national panels were, in a way, we started off with this quite interesting and maybe totally disregarded by at least 21 EU member states who did not even have this, kind of experiment on the national level. Yeah. So I mean, taking the idea of the CoFoE and break it down to the national, to the regional, to the local level, and do the same experiment there. And then, I mean, naturally you will have the kind of communication.
But Germany had a national.
Which I think, yeah. And again, I don't know if I should say this here, but I do it. I even learned it from the press that this would take place. Then I said, look, I mean, I have been installed here as being the national citizens representative, so it might be interesting. Oh, yes, of course. And so I then came in. I mean, again, I would say experiment. This is not a long excuse, but it explains a lot. But I mean, if I now say take whatever kind of setting you want, this would be unfair to those who have been so successful. But basically, start with something, and I mean, don't lose too much time in now inventing the one and only that works in all 27 member states. I mean, encourage every country to do it, and whatever you feel works where you come from. I mean, it was extremely interesting to learn that the Scandinavian countries, for instance, they did not have national panels. And the national citizens representatives, they were quite upset and they were angry. And then we talked about it, and then we found out that maybe the reason that CoFoE said, if you want to have formal national parliaments, you have to follow the OECD rules, and then the Scandinavian countries just, but look, this will not work in our country. And we had other kind of, events. And there was a huge debate on which kind of event would now, fit into the CoFoE and so on. So, but again, encourage people to communicate and do this on the local level, and then bring it up, bottom up, to whatever it will then be. And if we, by this, install in a very regular manner debates and dialogues. I mean, that is what we stand so much for. We have to have dialogues with politicians. We have not to have, just, express your opinion and send it to Brussels and hope that something happens, but get direct feedback from politicians if they say, okay, good idea, or not a good idea, because get into the dialogue and this will help. And it's a marathon. I mean, it's not a sprint. It takes a lot of time and energy. And again, that is maybe why I sit here, and you might get the feeling that I do not criticize enough. I could criticize that much. I mean, it was crazy by times. But then again, take what comes out of it and don't ruin it by just, talking about what did not work. Reflect about it and carry it on, but accept that a lot worked and do something with it.
Just to briefly add, to slightly also disagree with your assumption, I think it is also a question of PR. It is also a question of how much do you invest as a budget for communication activities. I think from previous participation projects that my company has delivered, as soon as you put this project, for example, CoFoE, on every bus, on every poster in the city, you will get more participants in the platform, you will get more media attention. It definitely is a question of how much are you willing to invest in communication activities. And I think that the CoFoE platform, for example, the reason why nobody knows it, or only basically the EU bubble, exactly the ones who deal with these topics anyways, are on it, is because I think it's not on A+, and it doesn't reach the people where they live, as you said.
And look into the working group on digital transformation, then you know why. I mean, there are so many parts of Europe, they could not even technically participate in the digital platform. I mean, it sounds gorgeous, but it doesn't work everywhere in the EU, not yet. So start with proposals. I can code it maybe first, and then we'll have a second digital platform.
So there are, I think we will have a last round of questions, and then we will statement to come to an end. But I assume that there is some question about the local level from you.
Yeah, my name is Mikkel Rossmann. I'm from Volt, and in English, I'm a vice mayor of Frankfurt. It sounds quite big, but I'm in German, here in Stadtrat in Magistratsstadt Frankfurt. So, yeah, let's say it's vice mayor. I would disagree with you that it was less successful because Europe is, European topics are so unsexy, because I think
politics, I mean, technical politics.
Yeah, but I do not feel that the coverage or the response from the public was much better than with the National Citizens Council in Germany, or the councils, or even in Frankfurt, the two local ones. I'm interested in deliberative democracy since years, and I'm a Frankfurt-based now politician, and I missed the first council. And then I'm still looking, why is it that so many people don't know about these kind of democratic tools? And I think it has a lot to do with that a lot of politicians are against it, because they think I'm the elected one and I should do this job, and not some by lot picked people. and that a lot of journalists don't understand this system and think that they are the ones who give input to the politicians and to the voters, so that they think they are doing my job, and of course lobby societies are thinking the same. So a lot of people fighting this kind of tool, or more precise, this kind of tools. So I don't think that the Irish model is the best one. I'm preferring the East Belgian one, or I preferred it for a long time. And now I think we are a Europe of different cultures, and for different problems, we have many different tools we could use for this problem or for this problem. And if it's so a big thing like the one in Ireland, then this model makes a lot of sense. And for the tiny things, it is very interesting model in East Belgium, makes a lot of sense. But I would always fight to have a regulation about that we do in Europe in future deliberative democracy in this one way. So let's have problems and solve it with fitting tools.
You're part of a city government, so what would be the concrete idea?
We as well supporting the democracy convent in Frankfurt. The problem is to, for example, to establish something like this East Belgian model, is that it's not in the hands of the city. So we have to get into the Hessen Parliament to fight for it. And hopefully other parties will do it as well, to establish something like that, like a second chamber to the city parliament. I would prefer it, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because every chosen into one of these councils is also an ambassador to his community to get into politics, and that it's much easier to get into politics than going into a party.
So we agree that it's not the model that counts, but that something happens. So you work on the politicians, that they support it, and I do my job, and I continue to mobilize citizens to engage in these models, and then I think we'll have a good outcome.
That's always a final statement. Was there any one who wanted to say something? So yeah, so maybe a last round here. There will obviously be a lot of opposition. What is the possibility member states just body check the parliament and say, well, stop. Nice deliberation, nice experiment, but how to perceive that?
Well, obviously, whether this kind of participation happens ever again at the European level depends partly on if anything happens with the stack. But beyond that, we have good proposals now that we need to implement, and that I think lots of people will fight for. If anyone stands in that way, they can, and they can probably delay this for quite a while, but they won't be able to stop this forever. This is the latest attempt of, some of the convinced people that EU needs reform. I think we have already gotten much further than many people thought a year ago. Maybe we don't have all these treaty changes on their way in a year's time, but I'm pretty convinced that change is coming. And if governments now want to block this, well, then we need to vote them out of office and put governments in place that actually defend what the citizens want, including their own citizens. That's ultimately how, in a democracy, how we change things, right? We have votes at the ballot box, and if they don't understand it now, well, they'll eventually get it. And I think the chances for change have never been this good. That already we have, I mean, again, look a couple of years ago, you could not find one government in the council that would have supported opening the treaties. Now you have Germany, France, Italy, the Benelux that openly say it. And I think there is more that are willing to consider. I mean, even among the 13 that have signed this non-paper, they're not saying, no, 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 never gonna happen. They say, let's not rush it. Well, obviously, for someone like me, I say, we have, since the Treaty of Lisbon entered into force, we've gone through the economic and financial crisis, we've had migration, we've had Brexit, we've had Corona, we now have a war in Ukraine. At that point, we didn't say, let's change the treaties. At that point, we said, let's sit down for 2 years in a conference with citizens and discuss what we do about it. Well, we got 1 year. That was many of the governments that are critical, they made it 1 year. Okay, we did that. Now, still, we're not saying, let's change the treaties. Now we're saying we want the possibility of starting a debate in a convention. So if those governments now say, look, you're rushing it, I have to say we're no longer in politics, we're in some sort of political comedy. But that's the fact. Because ultimately, on the big questions of treaty change, as you said, it's about power. It's about who ultimately decides in the European Union. Well, and citizens, civil society, the European Parliament, also the national parliaments have said, well, there is one institution that holds a bit too much power, and particularly one member of that one institution that can block everything, like Orban does now on the oil embargo, like the Polish now do on the taxation for large companies. And everyone else is getting more and more fed up. And I think what the Polish government and what Orban are doing right now is the strongest advertising campaign for getting rid of vetoes. So it will help us in the long run.
Thanks. Yeah, I would also just add to that. I think it's really great how we're already mainstreaming the topic of treaty change, because this was so taboo not very long ago. I mean, it's Democracy International for 10 years already been saying we need a convention now. 10 years ago it was like, don't utter those words because you're opening this Pandora's box that nobody wants to open. And now it's very mainstream to be discussing this, not just at the highest levels of government, which is exactly what we need, this kind of political courage, but that also citizens randomly selected now have gotten the comprehension to understand if we want A, B, and C, we're going to be treaty change. So that these two connections have come together, and that we see also in this time of crisis. I mean, after a health crisis, now we have also the war crisis, energy crisis that is going to be following the consequences of this war. Of course, that we see we're just reaching block after block and dead ends until we open these treaties, or at least have the possibility to do that. So I would just end on a hopeful note. Maybe June 23rd at the next EU summit. Do we have a majority for treaty change? I don't know, but I think that there's good trends in this direction. So if it's not this year, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball and keep the topic still mainstream. Don't let anything fall on the back burner, because I think there's the political momentum that's never really been so high.
Okay. Do you want to last statement?
Beyond the whole proposals and the treaty changes and all what's coming next in the CoFoE, I hope that one outcome of the conference is not only the concrete outcomes in terms of policies, but also the change in the democratic culture of the EU. That I think someone has said today, the genie's out of the bottle, and Ursula von der Leyen has already announced that there will be mini publics or citizen panels on 4 key legislative proposals in the future. If that is true, if that becomes true, then this is a great start. Maybe a first start to many other deliberative formats, such as the convention, for example, that could be also more deliberative in the future, or what have you, another conference on the future of Europe, for example. But so basically, I hope that this is also a key outcome of the whole CoFoE in terms of process.
Thank you very much. Thank you all on the panel for your engaged statements and reactions. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for your patience and listening to the discussion. And have a nice evening and wish the process all the best and good luck.